Thank you very much. Especially thank you to Tom and Bob for inviting me here this weekend. My title is called Epistemological Enclosure, or what would it mean to speak of a public university today? And just as John gave you the answer to some of that through sociology, I'm going to give some of the answers to that through humanities. Looking at it a different way. I'm going to do a little bit of philosophy today, perhaps. So I take my title this afternoon from my colleague at the Council for the Defence of British Universities, Tamsin PH, lecturer in colonial and post-colonial histories at Brunel University, who coined the phrase in a CDBU executive meeting. Such meetings are a cross between a school management group and a seminar in HE policy. The phrase epistemological enclosure was first forwarded by Tamsin as an attempt to define the mission of CDBU. It appears on the website in the section About Us. This is what it says. Higher education in the UK is experiencing a raft of reforms that are fundamentally reshaping what universities are, how they are governed and their ability to undertake their core task, the production of knowledge in all its guises. CDBU holds that these reforms are premised on two linked shifts associated with the marketisation of higher education. One, the instrumentalisation of knowledge and its production through mechanisms that seek to determine what the outcome of research will be. Two, the privatisation of public educational assets, for example, in which the costs and benefits of education accrue to the individual who can afford it rather than to the whole community. This amounts to what might be thought of as an enclosure of the epistemic commons. The CDBU firmly believes that the work undertaken in higher education institutions should be connected to other sectors of the economy, but the processes that underpin all education and knowledge are necessarily unpredictable and open-ended, so that the universities that support these processes must be maintained as autonomous institutions to protect them. Now, I do not wish to take issue with Tamsin here. Rather, in the spirit of what we might recognise as the university or the humanities, I would like to pick at it a little bit, or pick at the implications of this statement that appears on the CDBU website, a description of About Us. As with any organisation, CDBU is not one. It is not a commune or a school who all think in a similar way and agree on everything. I do not think that if we sat down together, any of us could agree on shared definitions of the terms council, defence, British and universities, although we might at a push and within certain parameters agree on the meaning of. After all, the executive group of CDBU is in the main a collection of concerned academics from the humanities. One would expect no less. I think enclosure of the epistemic commons is a fine phrase, which for most part I could countersign. However, today I would like to unpack what it might say around some examples of the current transformations in English higher education. And all the time I've got to remind myself to talk about English higher education, because this experiment is happening in England. It's like Chile under Pinochet. It's a kind of neoliberal experiment that's happening only in England at this moment in time. First of all, let me begin with the question of privatisation. What we're experiencing today in English universities is not privatisation in the normal sense as we've come to understand this term for our Friedmanite, Thatcherite inheritance. And yet, what up till now have been known as English universities do not have shareholders or a corporate structure deriving a profit from issued dividends. Universities in England on the whole are not yet private companies. Rather than has happened once upon a time, local education authorities controlled by local government funding universities to educate students, or in the more recent past, the arm's-length government quango, the Higher Education Fund Council, paying universities to take a certain number of students each year, we now have a re-engineering of the funding system in which individual students take out a loan from the student loans company to attend the university of their choice. The repayment terms of this loan are, in the present jargon, income contingent, and the student loans company is both unable to guarantee the terms of the loan, such as the interest rates, into the future, and is itself likely to be part of a true or proper privatisation of government assets in advance of the next general election. This was announced only last week, floated only last week as a concept. The student loans book would be sold off along with the post office before the next election. This situation has resulted in a quasi-privatisation of universities in England, whereby HEIs are no longer funded directly by the state to deliver a set number of graduates into the workforce, but rather contract with private individuals who use the government-backed voucher to purchase tertiary education as a traded service. The European Union now recognises the contract between individuals and the student loan company as a private funding arrangement and notes that the balance of funding in English universities has now shifted to 30-70 in favour of private over public income. On the one hand, this is an accountancy trick, the sort of so-called public-private finance initiative that the Conservative Party pointedly and correctly criticised the last Labour government for. As we know, the Student Loans Company receives its reserves from the Treasury, who have allocated those funds on the basis of government borrowing. The transfer to student finance then transforms public debt or borrowing into a fiscal asset, money owed to the government by individuals, which can be moved from one side of the Treasury's balance sheet to the other. It is perhaps for this reason alone that in my darker moments, I think it will be extremely difficult to reverse or correct the present funding regime because it requires a future government to rewrite the public accounts to recognise the liabilities of funding the student population. At this point, I would like to put down a marker for the argument that is to follow. That in the discussion of tuition fees in England, we are predominantly talking about the funding of the undergraduate offer. In contrast, universities have a diverse range of income streams, including publicly funded research via the research assessment schemes, Research Councils UK, and European Union funding, which is all taxpayer money, pure taxpayer money. But also research funding derived from charities and industrial collaboration, private endowments and charitable donations, while the top masters market in the UK has for a long time been an almost entirely privatised market of individual choice for many years. The same is true to a lesser extent of PhD programmes in the UK, in which so many of us as academics have such a significant psychic investment, but which in reality represent a small fraction of what our universities actually do. Now, that said, on the other hand, we should recognise these new tuition fees arrangements for what they are, to quote the CDBU website, the privatisation of public educational assets in which costs and benefits of education accrue to the individual who can afford it rather than to the whole community. The part justification of the present terms of student finance is that graduates are the primary beneficiaries of their time at university, and this is reflected in their earning capacity. I do not wish to unpack this assumption here. It is too depressing to think about late on a Saturday evening, and I have yet to get to the heart of my argument. Rather, I will simply comment that those who make this assumption clearly have led very sheltered lives. While the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills now recognise that the amount of the present loan book that will never be repaid due to lack of graduate earnings or individuals disappearing from the UK workforce entirely amounts to 35%. That is 1/3 of the present loan book will never be repaid. Even though BIS recognises this, as late as last week, the Minister for Higher Education, David Willetts, in an interview with the Times Higher, was optimistically crossing his fingers and hoping for the best, declaring the much criticised tuition fees arrangements sustainable on the grounds that graduate earnings would definitely rise in the future. Any economist or sociologist worth their university degree will tell you that such assertion would have to be surrounded by so many caveats that in present circumstances it would be wholly meaningless or have the status of no more than a hopeful speculation. So much for coalition policy. However, we now have the situation in which public funding for universities in England takes the form of Treasury-backed loans to individuals. This is not entirely, as yet, the privatisation of higher education, because at the same time there is a limit to the extent of government borrowing for the purpose of higher education. Accordingly, BIS have used direct powers of the Ministry and instructions to the Quango Hefsi to control and direct the behaviour of universities with respect to undergraduate student recruitment. A number of ad hoc initiatives have been launched in order to control the fiscal cost of the loan book by attempting to centrally direct the student number control in England. Only this month, Hefsi launched a new consultation on the student number control while quietly dropping the policy of margin core for September 2013. The reason that such policies have proved ineffective to date is because, and this is something to which we will need to return, universities are autonomous entities. Autonomy here will need to be distinguished from private. Right? And from the point of view of the Ministry, controlling the loan book in a world of student number deregulation is literally, well, it's not literally, it's figuratively, like herding cats. And the question of autonomy here, I mean, it's interesting. I'm sure the Conservative Party would welcome fully autonomous universities who said, we're autonomous and we take ourselves away from the state entirely. We don't want public funding, we will be autonomous. So the idea of autonomy is actually quite a complicated issue. Is the basis for a defence is a different thing from talking about the public university, I think. And actually, at this stage of the game, it's not clear whether HEFSE have any legal powers over universities, over student number control. Because as I say, student number, the relationship of the relationship of the student to the student loan company is a private relation, it's a private borrowing. They might as well be taking money from Barclays at that point. There's no reason why HEFSE have any legal powers over a university to cap numbers, right? And HEFSE are taking legal advice on this to see whether what would actually happen if a university challenged them over student number control. It is perhaps a profound irony that the one thing that might yet rein in the cost of the loan book is the price of fees themselves as a disincentive to study. The more expensive fees are, the less people are likely to take out the loan. So this brave new world of the privatisation of public educational assets is also characterised by the increasingly frantic direct control of those assets by the state, the sort of thing that Will Hutton was describing. We are in a perfect storm of the absolute alienation of privatisation and the complete inefficiency of ministry-controlled nationalisation. Other models for the management of national assets are available. All of this begins to point to a difficulty in discussing the question of the so-called public university. In reality, all universities in the UK are private institutions, which historically have had one client, the state. The UK government has, until the recent past, funded universities directly to teach undergraduates and train postgraduates according to national economic and cultural need, and in so doing have expanded the number of universities in the UK in order to answer a lack of supply within the HE sector. In taking powers over the local education authorities in 1992 to turn the then polytechnics into universities, the Minister of Education, Kenneth Baker, created a number of distinct corporate models for those new institutions. Many of them are companies limited by guarantee. When I, as a dean, sign documents agreeing to funding arrangements with sponsors, I do so not in the name of Kingston University, but in the name of something called Kingston University Educational Trust Company, brackets 1992. The public status of the post-92 university is complex, and its contestation has become the possible point of entry for private for-profit companies to enter the English HE market. We can talk about some examples of that later on. There's a big risk that if you have a company limited by private guarantee, a company limited by guarantee, that the corporate structure allows that to be taken over in a way that, by a private provider, in a way that wouldn't be possible with other corporate structures for universities. The Butler universities and the colleges of technology, which became universities in the 1960s, were also initiated in order to address the supply needs of a changing technology-led economy. They have royal charters, and their corporate structure looks much more like a traditional British university, but equally this would make them an even more attractive prospect for a private buyout. Historically, universities were supported, by which I mean funded, by the aristocracy and the church. The civic universities founded in the 19th century, many of which now make up the Russell Group, were founded by industrial philanthropists, Owens Men's College, the Leeds Cloth Workers College. They were never public universities as such, even if now they owe their elite status to the ironic fact that they have NHS hospitals attached to them. So what then do we mean by the idea of the public university? There are other versions of the university in the world, such as the higher education system of the state of California, which according to the now eviscerated master plan that John was referring to, the master plan for higher education, ran seamlessly from high schools to community colleges, the State University of California, to the expanding campuses of the University of California itself. This was, in a strict sense, a public university system that was designed to meet the cultural and economic needs of the Golden State. However, over time, as the state legislature has disinvested in intellectual curiosity. There's a famous speech by Ronald Reagan which says the state of California has no interest, should have no interest in intellectual curiosity, meaning you shouldn't fund the University of California. However, the stateless legislature has disinvested intellectual curiosity. The balance of funding in these institutions has also shifted in favour of privately held loans, and a university such as Berkeley is now as every bit dependent upon private finance and donations as its elite counterparts in England. In continental Europe, state-controlled universities run alongside an increasingly vibrant private sector, for the most part backed by private equity, and who have their quality assured by their European partners in British universities. I would like to suggest that the university would seem to be a space which was constantly in the process of opening itself up to and being opened up by both public need and private benefit. This matter is significant because the question of the public-private debate is one that is fundamental to the way in which modern Western political discourse is structured. Here's the science bit now, okay? There are a few political questions that are asked today that does not revolve around this access, the public-private access, including all of the questions of the world economic convulsions that are shaping our present scene. We can trace this division between the private and the public back to the founding of the modern nation-state and the inauguration of the diremption between the rights of the private citizen and the collective sovereignty of the will of the people. It is a massive question, one upon which all the states of democracy, for example, turns. It will be too big a task to unpack in the time afforded here. However, the key issue for us here is that the university today, the great experiment in higher education underway in England at this present moment, is the decisive index, the essential case study, if you will, of the operation of the public-private binary. Now, it is not, and it never has been, a simple case of one half of that binary opposing the other. A stark choice between a public university system and a fully private one. Rather, the very idea of the public depends for its definition on the concept of the private and vice versa. The public is the universalization of the particularity of the private individual. The idea of private represents a form of enclosure itself, in which a boundary is placed around one entity within the collective public to initiate a logic of inside and outside that predicates most of the terms of modern political thought, including property, taxation, representation, civil liberties, human rights, the welfare state, and so on. The border between what remains private to the individual and what becomes a question of public good is in no way stable and is constantly being remade and redefined by the same political discourse it predicates in the first place. It is a model of thinking that we might say is only held in place by a certain ideological investment, not only in the speculative capital afforded by the conceptualization of the binary, but also, and in a more difficult way to deal with, conceptualization itself as a form of binary thinking. Now, it's late on Saturday evening, after you've spent 2 days discussing the plight and futures of our universities, so I will not begin an exegesis in the question of logocentrism in Western political thought. Rather, by way of deepening the insight that I've offered here, what I wanted to do in the last sections, but there's 10 more pages, so I won't, is to give them, to just enrich that thought, really, with 2 examples. And what I'm suggesting here is a note of something for us to think about as academics, to say that on the one hand, there is no pure public university, right? And there never has been. But on the other hand, the separation, that this division of public and private, is the means in which the private acts out the ways in which it accumulates wealth. And the 2 examples I'll give of that are one, open access publishing, and the other is MOOCs, right? In the case of open access publishing, I've written a little bit about this before, is that there is a case that is made about openness, that openness is about the taxpayer having access to what is produced in the taxpayer's name in a university. And everything should be open on the internet, because that would be a good and democratic thing to do. But there's a slippage between public interest and openness, and again, like the question of autonomy, they're not quite the same thing, because the principles of open access doesn't begin out of an argument around taxpayer access to knowledge produced in their name. Rather, openness is a principle about what predicates scientific discovery and allowing access to knowledge by other groups. And the people who principally benefit out of the way that open access has now developed in the UK and out of government policy and out of RC UK policy are, on the one hand, those people who previously had to pay for access to this scientific data, who now no longer have to pay for it and have access to everything that universities do, and they're primarily scientific labs like AstraZeneca and IBM, right? Who no longer have to pay for this stuff. It's all open access. All of this stuff is now just been given. If it's all to be open access, all this things coming out of universities is now available to everyone. And at the same time, the model of open access that's developing, the other people who benefit are private publishers. It still keeps private publishers like Elsevier in business, paying article charges, precisely carries on that model of funding publishers. So you've got this around an argument that's made about the public and the public good. Actually, who's really benefiting out of this is two things. One, those companies that no longer have to pay for access to this, and two, the private publishers themselves. And the other example I would give of this is the question of MOOCs, massive open online courses, in which we are told that this, of course, is going to revolutionize access to higher education. This is a public good. All of these quality courses should be given away online. And, of course, many people have criticized the pedagogical nature of the MOOC, and that's probably a good thing to criticize in and of itself. But I think the point that's often missed about MOOCs is that Coursera and the other companies that have set up the platforms for MOOCs are private companies with shareholders who are looking for a way to monetize the output of MOOCs. And it's a way in which universities funded, universities such as Stanford, that fund Coursera as a spin-out company from Stanford, backed by private equity, are looking for a way in which, again, to drive profit out of an argument made about the public, but also using an argument for public good as a way of making private gain. So on the one hand, there's a question of understanding the complexity of what happens in a set of terms around the public and the private, both in terms of our thinking about what we mean when we talk about a public university, what a complex thing that might be, and at the same time, understanding the way in which those terms, public and private, are constantly operating in our universities and in political discourse in order to justify private profit as a public good. Thank you.